The Knockers by Matthew Kimbler. Have you ever had that strange, tingle down your spine feeling that you're being watched? If you've ever felt it, I'm sure you know exactly what I'm talking about. Most of the time, it's a feeling you get at night or after hearing an especially scary story. As a past listener of Creepypasta myself, I am well acquainted with the feeling. I used to associate it with a good scary story, though now I know better. Scary stories, after all, are remarkably less entertaining once they happen to you. A few months ago, I started noticing that feeling happening to me more often, despite not listening to any scary stories at the time. At first, I thought nothing of it, since I was used to the sensation. Eventually, I started to notice that it was happening quite often, though there's a forest behind my house, so I figured that if there was anything actually watching me, it was probably just one of the many deer that grazed in the backyard throughout the day. It's amazing how much a person can convince themselves that nothing is happening when it happens. This is especially true of the knocking. Once again, to begin with, I didn't even notice it. About the time I really started taking notice of the feeling of being watched, I also noticed a soft knocking sound on the side of the house, the windows, and even occasionally the ceiling. Even being on edge about the sensation of being watched, I convinced myself that it was just the sounds of trees brushing against the house or raindrops against the windows. After an embarrassing amount of time, my imagination finally took hold. Even then, I didn't take it too seriously and laughed about it with my parents over the phone. One day, when I was talking to my friends in a video call, my friends convinced me to knock back. Yeah, I know how stupid that probably sounds to you, but when you're in the moment, it doesn't seem that way. And even if you believe in it, until you experience the supernatural, your mind tries hard to convince you that it isn't possible. After knocking back, things got increasingly worse. The feeling of being watched was a lot stronger, and eventually never even subsided. The knocking got louder as well, to a point where even my sound-canceling headphones weren't enough to block out the sound without something playing through them at max volume. Even with this being the case, a human's coping mechanisms are impressive. I told myself that there was probably a bird or a squirrel taking up residence in my ceiling. I think I was able to convince myself of this because of an experience I had when I was younger at my family's home. Late in the night, my sister had woken me up, telling me that there was a knocking sound coming from her ceiling and walls. Of course, at the time I didn't believe her, as it wasn't far-fetched that she was just pulling my leg, as she had done plenty of times before. When I went into her room, I didn't hear a thing, and told her to stop messing with me. She told me that she wasn't, and she could still hear the sound. I brushed her off and went to bed anyway. Later that week, our parents had told us that they had found some birds that had gotten into the vent under the roof, and that the sound was probably from that. As I hadn't heard the noise, I wasn't all that interested, and my sister hadn't brought up the noise after that. The animals in the ceiling didn't end up being the answer for me, but you probably figured that out already. That being said, at the time I had my parents come over and look for me since they were experienced with this sort of thing. Like with my sister, they told me they didn't hear anything, but they checked for me anyway. They told me that they did in fact find a vent that was open, and there was even a dead bird inside. They ended up cleaning it out and sealing up the vent. Before going home, they offered for me to stay with them for a few nights if it was still bothering me. I ended up taking them up on their offer, and it was the best sleep I had gotten in a while. Eventually, I decided I had outstayed my welcome, or in other words, got sick of my parents, and went back to my house. When I got back, I was greeted with a now overly familiar feeling, though the knocking at least was gone for the moment. After a while, I grew accustomed to the feeling of being watched, and was able to live my life in relative peace for a time. Today, however, I made the decision to look outside my window, one of the times that I felt especially like I was being watched. To my disbelief, it wasn't a deer that I saw. Instead, there was a tiny creature looking back at me. Although I saw the creature, I couldn't make out specific details. It was as if I was looking through it. The creature raised what I assumed was its hand, knocking on the window. This time, there was no convincing myself otherwise. The knocking was the exact same as what I used to hear before it had stopped. Naturally, I was frozen in place for a while. Eventually, the creature scuttled away, and with it, the feeling of being watched. The lack of that feeling, after having grown used to it, was enough to shake me from my daze. After that, I sat down for a while, and eventually decided to write about it. While writing, I was greeted with the feeling of being watched occasionally. Each time I looked, the creature was in the window, and knocked when I saw it. I know that I should probably be scared, but for some reason, I'm not. I don't think these creatures are actually dangerous. I think they are more like the gatekeepers for the supernatural. Until you acknowledge them, you can't see them, or hear them. After all this, I'm left with one conclusion. What I saw was real, and maybe some of the creatures from the stories I've heard before are real as well. I'm sure that I'll be meeting more of them soon, though I hope they are just as friendly as what I'm calling the knockers. Assuming I don't die, I'll make sure to write about my experiences if I have any more. The last thing I'll say to you is if you hear a knocking and don't want to be a part of the supernatural, don't knock back. Hi, Matthew Kimbler here. This creepypasta is actually using experiences that I've had in my life and using it as inspiration for the story. So everything that happened in this, in some capacity, has happened to me in my life, although perhaps a little bit twisted to make it a little more fit for storytelling. The part about my sister hearing the sounds in her room and having there be a bird in the ceiling was actually a true story, and it actually happened significantly in my past. However, the basis for me starting this story is actually from quite recent. I'm in a room that has a skylight that when it rains, occasionally you can hear a kind of knocking sound, and that's where I drew the inspiration from. At a later point, I actually thought about using that as an element for a story, and while thinking about that, I'm like, I think a creepypasta would be good for that. And while planning for it, I actually got that tingly feeling down your spine that you get when you listen to like a scary story. And I used that as well as the knocking as the key elements in my story. The really ironic thing about it is that when I was trying to record the creepypasta, it actually started raining, and so at intermittent parts of the recording, you can actually hear the knocking sound that I used as inspiration. And I found it so hilarious that I just had to keep it in there. And there was a point in it that I wasn't recording, and it caught a really good knocking sound. So I used that at the very end when it says, "Don't knock back," and then it knocks. And I thought that was just perfect. Another thing to note is that this is actually my first creepypasta that I've ever written. And while I have heard a lot of creepypastas, I haven't actually read many. So I did a little bit of reading before I started recording this, just to get kind of a feel for it. I ended up recording quite a few versions of it, and each time I did, the accent that I used got a little worse each time. So at this very final recording, it's pretty thick on my "and then it happened" type of deal. But I was really happy with the quality of it for the most part, and after like 3 hours of trying to record it to perfection, you kind of just give up. I hope you guys can see the good in it like I can, but I really enjoyed the whole entire process of it, and I probably will continue making more of them down the line. So make sure to look forward to that and subscribe. But until then, make sure to just keep writing.